CCP released a video of a new drone-swarming bomb weapon system, but it appears to be a knockoff of a similar program under the Pentagon. And after China lost its special trade status through Hong Kong, it's now looking to set up Shenzhen City with the same type of trade functions as Hong Kong. I'll be going into this. And also, the US and Russia are pushing forward with disarmament of nuclear weapons. And while the US is also attempting to get China to disarm, the CCP has shot back with harsh criticisms and disinformation to protect its nuclear weapons program. I'll be taking an in-depth look at this. Welcome back, everyone. First off, some breaking news. The Chinese Communist Party has signaled in a new move that fears of a food crisis in China may be well-founded. Reports of this were carried by South China Morning Post, which has been leaning more heavily towards the Chinese Communist Party after it was purchased by Chinese internet tycoon Jack Ma back in 2015. Now, it said that China's Legislative Affairs Commission is putting together a new law that will ban food waste. This builds on the similar program under Xi Jinping, the so-called Clean Plates program that was released back in August. And in addition to this, the CCP is working on a new law on grain supplies, which South China Morning Post reports is being released, quote, as the issue of food security has become more important amid souring relations with the United States. Now, what was the context of this? Remember, during the height of the pandemic, rumors of a food crisis started during that time, and panic buying was sparked by alleged leaked documents that were saying CCP officials was warning them, allegedly, that there would be food shortages, and it told them to prepare food supplies ahead of the shortages. Now, this was allegedly caused by a combination of people in China being out of work and of problems with logistics caused by the lockdowns, and also by other countries around China keeping tighter export controls in their food supplies due to the pandemic. Then, the Chinese Communist Party also faced large-scale floods in southern and central China, droughts in northern China, and then locust swarms. And the country is also facing outbreaks of the swine flu and the avian flu, which is cutting into its meat supplies. And it was in this context that Xi Jinping announced the Clean Plates program while the regime's media was still denying there was a food crisis in the country. Yet the latest stories on this suggest the regime is now warning publicly of a food crisis. It seems now this is hitting the surface in China. And meanwhile, with the CCP virus, there are more lockdowns in China. After the CCP started new lockdowns just recently in Qingdao City, which we reported on previously, it is now showing signs of expanding lockdowns in Guangzhou City after staff at a hotel were diagnosed with asymptomatic infections. On October 16th, the regime locked down the hotel, and it's now requiring people in the surrounding villages and towns to undergo nucleic acid testing. And also, just like in Qingdao, as we mentioned, they're launching this program to basically test every single person in the entire city. It seems they're expanding on that model. Now, the Epoch Times was able to confirm the lockdowns in Guangzhou through phone interviews. Now, you might remember as well, the virus outbreaks in China never ended. The CCP still has lockdowns across the country. Many parts of the country are still in lockdown, and they're putting new lockdowns in place. Now, the Chinese Communist Party declared it was over after it determined the lockdowns were too damaging to the economy to continue. You might remember the context of this. The virus was the biggest story in China. It was all they were talking about. Then what happened? The CCP did an analysis and found that it was destroying the Chinese economy. CCP leader Xi Jinping came out and gave a speech announcing it was causing too much harm, and then right after that, Chinese state media declared the virus in China was over. No new cases. And many Western media have repeated this. And what's happening now? The Chinese Communist Party has reopened travel with Europe at a time, again, when it's lying to the world, saying there's no more virus cases, while at the same time putting parts of its country on lockdown. It reopened travel with Europe at a time now when Europe is also now having travel restrictions to the United States. And as this happens, there are now new virus outbreaks in Europe. Now, was this situation sparked by them recently opening travel to China? And could this also give us hints that the virus situation in China may be worse than what we're being told? Well, we'll have to see how this goes going forward, and we'll keep you updated as news emerges on it. Now, in other news, the CCP released a video of a new swarming drone bomb system, which appears to be a knockoff of a similar U.S. weapon system. The CCP's state-owned China Electronics Technology Group Corporation posted a video on YouTube just recently that shows ground-based systems launching tubes which then unfold into gliding bombs that can be remotely controlled. It also showed one of these drone bombs being launched from a helicopter. Now, that weapon system they're showing looks like almost an exact copy of the US 901 drone swarm system that was unveiled by the US Office of Naval Research, right down to the wing design on the drones. Now, again, what are we seeing here? Now, it's important to note, just because the CCP releases a video of a weapon system doesn't necessarily mean that it works. It's fairly common in the military community in any part of the world to release demonstration videos of weapon systems and even military reports as a type of strategic disinformation. Many countries do this, even Western countries. Now, this is meant to throw off adversaries who may develop weapons and countermeasures in response to what they're showing. Now, this isn't to say this new drone swarm system is fake, but this is always a factor to consider. And also, with the Chinese Communist Party especially, its technologies often aren't as effective as they claim they are. And there's another important point to add on to this. One of the big discussions in the US defense community right now is the Chinese Communist Party having researchers at some of the US research programs working on Pentagon projects. They've noted the Chinese Communist Party, by doing this, is getting taxpayer-funded research on weapons technologies and then bringing it back to China through these researchers. Now, was that the case with this? It's not clear yet. No reports on it yet that I've seen. But it does seem the weapons are almost identical to each other. And again, we'll have to see how this goes going forward. Now, meanwhile, after the CCP lost its special trade status with Hong Kong, after the regime ended its international agreements on Hong Kong's basic rights, it is looking to replace its economic system with Shenzhen City. RFA reports that Xi Jinping announced plans on October 14 to put Shenzhen at the heart of a new integrated economic zone that will include Hong Kong and the island of Macau. The regime had already set up Macau with some of the same financial structures that Hong Kong had, which could replace what it lost through international pressure on Hong Kong. And Shenzhen is also designated as a special economic zone by the CCP, which changes the way it regulates businesses. Now, folks, again, what are we seeing here? You might remember what happened with Hong Kong. The Chinese Communist Party used to use Hong Kong as its free trade hub to get money out of China and for other trade benefits around the world. It ending its agreement of autonomy with Hong Kong, of ending its one country, two systems agreement, was a stupid move by many regards because it lost that trade status, and the CCP needs that trade status. Now, for a lot of us watching that incident unfold, it seemed like this was a very rash idea by the Chinese Communist Party because it cannot afford to lose that. But there's some other details to this, which is that as it happened, about a year prior to this, the Chinese Communist Party had established the same type of trade agreement that Hong Kong had in Hainan. It's another island. Now, leaked documents obtained by the Epoch Times from the CCP's Hainan Provincial Development and Reform Commission included details on its 14th five-year plan to establish a free trade port in Hainan, which would again likely set up the island with the same type of free trade operations that Hong Kong used to have serving the Chinese Communist Party. Again, we reported on this previously. And now it seems the Chinese Communist Party is expanding this. Macau is the key part in this because Macau and Hainan work closely together. And so they're using Macau, Hainan, Hong Kong, and Shenzhen together in this new program, basically to replace any loss they had from what they did to Hong Kong. And as part of this new move with Shenzhen, and Shenzhen is already seen as a rival sister city to Hong Kong and was also a technology hub for China, Xi Jinping said he'll be giving it more autonomy, relaxed capital controls, and other forms of leniency that will allegedly help it develop. Now, again, it's ironic that when the CCP wants to help a place develop economically, all it does is relinquishes some of the totalitarian controls on its economy. Now, this ties into one of the broader narratives the CCP pushes, and one which I've heard repeated even by respectable economists. The Chinese Communist Party claims it lifted the Chinese people out of poverty and into the modern age. What it fails to note is that the whole world went through similar transformations over the 20th century, and nearly all of the technological advancements the CCP takes credit for were developed by free countries in the West. And the CCP's claims on helping the Chinese people become more wealthy was on account that in the Mao era, the Chinese Communist Party restricted people from engaging in private business. It was only when the regime let up on its totalitarian policies, relinquished some of those policies, that the Chinese people through their own efforts began to prosper. This is comparable to someone holding a person's head underwater and when they let them up for air, telling the world they saved someone from drowning. Now, in other news, after Secretary of State Mike Pompeo once again called out China's attempts to subvert the American education system, China responded with some harsh words. Now, with some context on this, in a joint letter with Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos, Pompeo pointed out a, quote, real and growing threat to American educational institutions, which is the, quote, malign influence of the authoritarian government of the People's Republic of China, or PRC, on our nation's campuses. Now, Zhao Lijian, spokesperson of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, responded by calling Pompeo's words slander.
蓬佩奥等美国一些政客出于意识形态偏见和一己政治私利，污蔑抹黑孔子学院。
Now, an interesting point to note is that during the same press conference, Zhao also talked about China's well-documented persecution of ethnic groups and said instead,
所谓中国新疆迫害穆斯林，犯下反人类罪，是一些反华势力蓄意炮制的耸人听闻的话题。
Now, again, what are we seeing? The Chinese Communist Party always does this. They deny things that are blatant reality. The Chinese Communist Party's persecution of Xinjiang Muslims is well known, the Muslim Uyghurs. Its persecution of Christians is well documented. Its use of live organ harvesting against Falun Gong practitioners is also well documented. The Chinese Communist Party's crimes against humanity are known throughout the world. Now, again, what are they doing? This is a common tactic of the Chinese Communist Party. You deny something and then you shift the blame and accuse the other person of doing exactly what you did. The Chinese Communist Party, rather than admit the well-documented fact that it has slave camps, that it uses re-education through labor, that it tortures people, that it kills people for believing in religion, that it uses Falun Gong practitioners as living sources for organ transplants, and also of its subversive systems like the Confucius Institute, also well documented and being banned in different countries around the world, from the United States to Canada to Sweden. The Chinese Communist Party does the same thing, these tactics of denying and then shifting the blame. And here again they're telling the media that all of this is fake. Then they turn around and say that the criticism against its human rights abuses are other countries trying to suppress China. Now, meanwhile, while the United States and Russia have been reducing their stockpiles of nuclear weapons and are engaging in negotiations for further disarmament, the Chinese regime has been expanding its stockpiles of nuclear weapons. And as the U.S. has attempted to engage the CCP on disarmament, the regime has denied the scale of its nuclear stockpile, which is actually believed to be at the same level as the United States and Russia. And it also sent mixed messages on its intentions behind using them, as it claims a no first use policy externally while discussing first use, including EMP attacks, in its own military doctrines. Now, the CCP recently told the United States it would not participate in proposed, quote, trilateral arms control negotiations. During a meeting of the UN General Assembly's Disarmament and International Security Committee on October 12th, the CCP's deputy permanent representative to the UN, Geng Shuang, said the negotiations were a trick to shift international focus and accused the U.S. of using it as a trick to, quote, free its hands and gain absolute military supremacy. It then claims that the Chinese Communist Party's pursued nuclear development for self-defense, and then claimed it would, quote, never take part in any nuclear arms race with any other country. Geng also stated, quote, China will never participate in such a negotiation and will never accept any coercion or blackmail. Now, in the Pentagon's 2020 report on China, which was released back in September, it stated that, quote, the number of warheads on the PRCs, that's People's Republic of China, land-based ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missiles, capable of threatening the United States is, quote, expected to grow to roughly 200 in the next 5 years. Now, it notes that over the last 10 years, the CCP's nuclear warhead stockpile is estimated to be in the low 200s, and the U.S. expects the regime to at least double its stockpile going forward. Now, again, the Chinese Communist Party claims it has a no first use policy on nuclear weapons, but its own military doctrines have gone the other way with this. They've talked about using first use when it comes to nuclear weapons. They've also told their military to be prepared for, say, nuclear attacks. They were holding these drills in China just recently. One of the main forms of surprise attack it talks about using nuclear weapons is what they call HEMP attacks. This is the detonation of nuclear weapons in the high Earth orbit over a country. The idea is that doing so would fry the electronics of that country, fry the entire electric grid through the EMP, electromagnetic pulse, which is one of the side effects of a nuclear blast. Now, people have warned about what that would look like for the United States. The idea is if you destroy the entire electric grid in the United States, that means that all infrastructure shuts down. And a lot of the Chinese Communist Party's doctrines on surprise attack, which if they ever engaged in a real military strike on the US, that's what it would look like. They talk about how they would use this alongside other forms of attack to basically blind the US and then strike. In the UK, the chief of its MI5, its domestic counterintelligence agency, said the country will do more to counter spy threats from China, and said the UK is working on laws to block foreign deals for security reasons and to stop foreign takeovers of its businesses. Now, at universities in the UK as well, there is growing pushback against foreign interference from China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. According to the Times UK, professors at Oxford and SOAS University of London have begun using anonymity rules when lecturing on topics sensitive to the CCP in order to protect students from being punished by the Chinese Communist Party if they join these classes. And in Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau criticized the CCP for its human rights abuses and for what he described as, quote, coercive diplomacy. The Chinese regime responded to this by issuing a complaint. And also in the United States as well, the State Department and education officials are calling for a review of the CCP's Confucius Institutes. These are the institutes put in U.S. universities and schools which the Chinese Communist Party finances and are used for different purposes within our universities and school system. RFA reports that they're warning the institutes give the CCP a, quote, foothold for political influence at American colleges and universities, and also threatens free speech at those campuses. Now again, what are we seeing here? The issue of Chinese subversion has gone from being an abstract concept to a mainstream topic of discussion. And when the CCP passed its national security laws over Hong Kong, even say, for example, being able to extradite people from other countries to China, its human rights abuses went from being a distant problem to something that could impact every single person if they criticize the CCP. Now in other news, China ranked last in a new international ranking on internet freedom, making it the world's most repressive country when it comes to free debate and the flow of information online. The Washington-based think tank Freedom House released its annual report on global internet freedom on October 14th and described the CCP as, quote, the worst abuser of internet freedom. The report states that the condition for internet users in China has deteriorated continually and confirms the CCP's status as, quote, the world's worst abuser of internet freedom for the 6th consecutive year. It says the CCP responded to protests in Hong Kong and in its cover-up of the CCP virus, which began in Wuhan, China, with, quote, censorship and surveillance. It says these were pushed to unprecedented extremes as the government enhanced its information controls. Now in China, the Chinese Communist Party has many different systems for censoring the internet. One of the main ones is the Great Firewall. We've talked before about, say, their armies of internet trolls, the 50-cent army. Things like the propaganda department, which maintains the, say, standards of the narratives they're pushing online and overseas. But the Great Firewall is one of the main tools it uses to censor the internet internally in China. And again, I've raised the question of why would they do this? Why would they feel the need to censor information being shown to the Chinese people? It's because they're afraid. The Chinese Communist Party is afraid of the free flow of information because it knows one of its biggest weak points is ideology. And if people are able to see accurate information from outside of China, they will know the Chinese Communist Party has been lying to them their entire lives. They will see the information the Chinese Communist Party has been trying to cover up. And if the Chinese people are allowed to openly criticize their government and openly criticize its leaders, which they're not allowed to do without facing repercussions, if they're allowed to do that, the Chinese Communist Party knows it cannot withstand that kind of pushback. It knows that if people are able to see how all the different people in China oppose it, what they really think of it, and if it allows free debate among the Chinese people on this, then the narratives of the Chinese Communist Party will fall apart. This is a sign of weakness by the Chinese Communist Party. And also it's notable that in addition to these more direct forms of censorship, the Chinese Communist Party has indirect forms of censorship. One of the big things it pushes for is self-censorship. Now, those of you who read 1984 by George Orwell might know the ideas he talked about when it comes to black, white, and when it comes to his different ideas of newspeak. One of the things he talks about in that book is this idea, hypothetically speaking, that people are willing to, say, alter the way that they think. Not just the way they speak, not just what they do, but alter the way they think fundamentally because they're afraid of violating the thought control programs of that mythical regime in 1984. Now, in 1984, it talks about this fictional idea of Ingsoc, English socialism, and this regime that has different forms of social controls, such as, say, thought control, such as speech control, and so on. The Chinese Communist Party has real systems like this. One of the big ones it has for self-censorship is the social credit system, where you can have points deducted from your citizen score if you interact with, quote, bad people. If, for example, you visit websites the Chinese Communist Party doesn't like you visiting. If, for example, you associate with information or believe in things even, when it comes to your personal beliefs, that go against what the Chinese Communist Party is trying to control. The CCP, in addition to directly blocking information, gives the Chinese people an incentive, otherwise they'll be punished for it, an incentive to intentionally over-censor themselves in order to get good citizen scores, which gives them more freedom in the society. Now, that said, folks, we're again broadcasting 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. Also, if you want to support us, please join us on Patreon. You can find the link to our Patreon page in the description below. If you haven't already also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps our channel. And if you want to go the extra mile, please tell a friend or family member about Crossroads. Now, with that said, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.